Sometimes the past reaches out with gentle fingers, and sometimes it grabs you by the throat. For Jake Morrison, it would do both on the same dusty afternoon when a woman's voice cut through 20 years like a blade through silk, asking a question that would unravel the carefully built walls around his heart. In a world where heroes are just regular people who happen to be in the right place at the right time, what happens when the person you saved grows up to save you back? This is the story of a cowboy who thought his heroic moment was behind him, and the woman who proved that some rescues take decades to complete. Jake Morrison had always believed that life was like breaking horses. You had to stay on long enough for the wild bucking to stop, and, if you were lucky, eventually you'd find yourself riding smooth. At 42, he figured he'd been riding smooth for quite some time now. His ranch outside Millfield, Texas, wasn't the biggest spread in the county, but it was his. The red barn needed paint, the fence posts leaned at angles that would make a geometry teacher weep, and his old blue pickup truck had more miles on it than a traveling salesman, but everything worked just fine. The morning started like any other. Jake rolled out of bed at 5:30, pulled on his worn jeans and boots that had molded to his feet like old friends, and shuffled to the kitchen. The coffee maker gurgled to life, filling the quiet house with the only sound he needed to hear. Through the window above the sink, he could see his cattle dotting the pasture like scattered poker chips, and, beyond them, the rolling hills stretched toward a sky that was just beginning to blush pink. His border collie, Rex, padded into the kitchen and sat at attention, tail sweeping the floor in lazy arcs. Jake scratched behind the dog's ears and filled his bowl with kibble. Rex had been with him for 8 years now, ever since Jake found him as a stray puppy wandering the back roads. The dog had a way of looking at him that reminded Jake of his late father, patient, understanding, and slightly judgmental when Jake forgot to eat regular meals. The ranch routine was as familiar as breathing. Check the water troughs, inspect the fence line, count heads to make sure none of the cattle had wandered off or gotten themselves into trouble. Jake had been doing this dance for nearly 15 years, ever since he'd bought the place with money he'd saved from his rodeo days and a settlement from an accident that ended his competitive riding career. The accident had taken his left shoulder's full range of motion, but it had given him something more valuable, the push he needed to stop chasing buckles and start building something permanent. By mid-morning, Jake was fixing a section of fence that his neighbor's bull had decided to test with his thick skull. The work was methodical, satisfying in the way that physical labor could be when your mind needed to stay occupied. He'd learned over the years that idle hands led to idle thoughts, and idle thoughts had a way of wandering into territories he preferred to keep fenced off. The sound of a car engine broke through his concentration. Jake looked up to see a silver sedan making its way down his gravel driveway, dust billowing behind it like a wake. Visitors were rare out here. Most folks who had business with him called first, and the mail carrier had already come and gone. He set down his wire cutters and walked toward the house, Rex trotting alongside him with the alertness of a dog who took his property protection duties seriously. The sedan came to a stop near the front porch, and Jake could see the outline of a woman behind the wheel. She sat there for a long moment, as if gathering courage or checking her reflection in the rearview mirror. When she finally stepped out, Jake felt something shift in his chest, like a puzzle piece clicking into place in a picture he didn't know he was assembling. She was tall, with auburn hair that caught the sunlight and moved like silk in the gentle breeze. Her jeans and boots suggested she wasn't a city tourist who'd taken a wrong turn, but there was something polished about her that spoke of a life beyond ranch gates. She moved with the kind of confidence that came from facing the world head-on, but Jake caught a flicker of uncertainty in her green eyes as they met his across the yard. "Jake Morrison," she called out, her voice carrying a slight tremor that betrayed her composed appearance. "That's me," he replied, touching the brim of his hat in a gesture that was pure instinct. "Can I help you with something?" She took a few steps closer, and Jake noticed she was carrying a manila envelope. Her hands, he observed, were steady despite that tremor in her voice. Professional hands, with neat nails and a simple gold watch that looked expensive. "My name is Sarah Chen," she said, extending her right hand as she approached. Jake shook it, noting the firm grip and the slight callus on her index finger, a detail that suggested she wasn't entirely foreign to manual work despite her polished appearance. "I was hoping we could talk about something that happened a long time ago." Jake felt his stomach tighten the way it always did when the past tried to intrude on his carefully ordered present. 20 years of living quietly had taught him that people usually only showed up with manila envelopes when they wanted something or when trouble was brewing. Sometimes both. "I'm not sure what I could tell you about anything from long ago," he said carefully. "My memory's not what it used to be." Sarah smiled, and it transformed her entire face. The uncertainty faded, replaced by something warmer and more determined. "Oh, I think you remember more than you're letting on, Jake Morrison. Especially about a night 20 years ago when you pulled a 7-year-old girl out of a car that was about to go over the Sweetwater Bridge." The words hit Jake like a physical blow. His hand instinctively moved to his left shoulder, where old injuries had a way of acting up when his stress levels rose. The Sweetwater Bridge incident wasn't something he ever talked about. Hell, it wasn't something he ever thought about if he could help it. But, suddenly, standing in his own front yard with this confident woman watching him with those knowing green eyes, the whole night came rushing back with startling clarity. It had been raining, the kind of torrential downpour that turned Texas back roads into rivers. Jake had been driving home from a rodeo in Austin, tired and sore from a particularly unforgiving bronc that had launched him into the arena dirt with more enthusiasm than usual. The windshield wipers on his old truck had been fighting a losing battle against the rain, and he'd been taking the curves on Sweetwater Road slower than usual, knowing that the bridge ahead could be treacherous in weather like this. That's when he'd seen the taillights sliding sideways through the rain. A car had hydroplaned on the slick asphalt, spun out of control, and slammed through the bridge's guardrail. By the time Jake had pulled over and run to the edge, the vehicle was hanging at a precarious angle, its front end suspended over the churning water 20 feet below. The driver, a woman, was unconscious and bleeding from a head wound. But it was the crying from the back seat that had galvanized Jake into action. A little girl, maybe 7 years old, with dark hair and terrified eyes, was trapped in the wreckage. The car had been creaking and settling, metal groaning under the strain, and Jake had known without a doubt that the whole thing was going to give way at any moment. He'd climbed down the muddy embankment, ignoring the pain in his shoulder from that night's ride, and worked his way along the twisted guardrail until he could reach the back seat window. Getting the girl out had required breaking the window with a rock and cutting through her seatbelt with his pocket knife. She'd been crying for her mother, reaching toward the front seat where the woman lay motionless. Jake had promised her that help was coming for her mom, that everything would be okay, that she just needed to come with him right now. The trust in her eyes as she'd reached for his hand had nearly broken his heart. He'd carried her up the embankment just as the car gave a final groan and plunged into the swollen creek below. The impact had sent up a splash that soaked them both, and the little girl had clung to his neck with surprising strength. Emergency responders had arrived minutes later, summoned by a passing motorist who'd seen the accident, but by then, Jake had already pulled the woman from the water. She'd been alive, barely, and the paramedics had worked on her for what felt like hours before getting her stable enough to transport. Jake had given his statement to the highway patrol, declined any interviews with local reporters who'd gotten wind of the story, and gone home to ice his shoulder and try to forget about the whole terrifying experience. He'd never followed up on what happened to the woman and her daughter. He'd told himself it was because he didn't want to intrude on their recovery, but the truth was simpler and more complicated. Jake Morrison wasn't comfortable being anybody's hero. He fixed fence, raised cattle, and minded his own business. Dramatic rescues weren't supposed to be part of his story. Now, 20 years later, that little girl was standing in his front yard as a grown woman, holding a manila envelope and looking at him with eyes that had never forgotten. "You remember," Sarah said softly. "It wasn't a question. I thought you might. Some things are too big to forget, even when we try." Jake found his voice, though it came out rougher than he intended. "Your mother. Is she?" "She survived," Sarah said quickly, seeing the worry that flashed across his weathered face. "She spent 3 months in the hospital and had to relearn how to walk, but she survived. Because of you." The relief that washed over Jake was unexpected in its intensity. For 20 years, he'd carried a nagging worry that he'd been too late, that his rescue had been incomplete. Knowing that both the woman and her daughter had made it through that night lifted a weight from his shoulders that he hadn't fully realized he'd been carrying. "That's good," he managed. "That's real good to hear." Sarah stepped closer, and Jake could see flecks of gold in her green eyes. Up close, he could detect traces of the frightened 7-year-old she'd once been, but they were overlaid with the confidence and strength of the woman she'd become. "I've been looking for you for 5 years," she said. "It took me that long to track you down. You never left any contact information with the police, and the newspaper only identified you as a local cowboy who asked not to be named. For a while there, I was starting to think you were some kind of guardian angel who'd vanished back into the night." Jake felt heat creep up his neck. "I'm no angel, ma'am. Just happened to be in the right place at the right time." "Sarah," she corrected gently. "And you were exactly the right person in exactly the right place at exactly the right time." "Do you have any idea what that means to someone?" Before Jake could answer, she opened the manila envelope and pulled out a photograph. It showed a young woman in a graduation cap and gown, beaming at the camera with unmistakable joy. She handed it to Jake, who took it with careful fingers. "Medical school," Sarah explained. "University of Texas Southwestern. I graduated 2 years ago and I'm finishing my residency in emergency medicine at Dallas Presbyterian. I became a doctor because a cowboy I'd never met risked his life to save mine and my mother's. I wanted to spend my life doing the same thing you did that night, giving people second chances." Jake stared at the photograph, trying to reconcile the accomplished young doctor with the terrified child from his memories. The transformation was remarkable, but he could see the same determined spirit in both versions of Sarah Chen. "That's mighty impressive," he said, handing the photo back. "Your folks must be proud." "My mother is incredibly proud," Sarah agreed. "She's the one who encouraged me to find you. She said she couldn't rest easy knowing that the man who saved our lives never got a proper thank you." The conversation was moving into territory that made Jake deeply uncomfortable. He'd never been good at accepting gratitude, especially for something he considered any decent person would have done. The idea that his actions had influenced someone's entire career path was both humbling and overwhelming. "No thanks needed," he said, falling back on the response that had served him well in similar situations. "Like I said, anyone would have done the same thing." Sarah shook her head firmly. "That's where you're wrong, Jake Morrison. I've seen plenty of accidents in my line of work, and I can tell you that most people drive right past. They don't stop, they don't get involved, they don't risk their own safety for strangers. What you did took courage, and it saved 2 lives that night." A comfortable silence settled between them, broken only by the distant lowing of cattle and the whisper of wind through the oak trees that shaded Jake's front yard. Rex had settled into a patch of sunlight, apparently deciding that this visitor posed no threat to his territory. "Can I ask you something?" Sarah said finally. Jake nodded, though he braced himself for whatever was coming. "Do you ever think about that night? About what happened after?" The honest answer was yes, more often than he cared to admit. The memory had a way of surfacing at unexpected moments, when storm clouds gathered over the ranch, when he heard a child crying, when he drove past the rebuilt Sweetwater Bridge on his way to town. But, admitting that felt like opening a door he'd kept carefully locked for 20 years. "Sometimes," he said instead, which was true enough without being the whole truth. Sarah studied his face with the careful attention of someone trained to read vital signs and assess conditions. "I think about it all the time," she said quietly. "Not the scary parts, though those took years of therapy to work through. I think about the moment when you reached through that broken window and told me everything was going to be okay. Your voice was so calm, so certain. I believed you completely." Jake felt something twist in his chest. "You were a brave little girl." "I was terrified," Sarah corrected with a small laugh. "But you made me feel safe. Even hanging over that creek in a car that was about to fall, with my mother unconscious in the front seat, you made me feel like everything really was going to be okay." The weight of that trust, remembered across 20 years, settled on Jake's shoulders like a mantle he'd never asked to wear. He'd spent 2 decades thinking of that night as a single incident, a moment of crisis that had passed into history. The idea that it had shaped someone's entire life, that the frightened child had grown up carrying his words and his example, was almost too much to process. "What I don't understand," he said slowly, "is why you went to all the trouble to track me down. You've built yourself a good life, made something meaningful out of what happened. Seems like you've got all the closure you need." Sarah's smile was gentle but determined. "Because the story isn't finished yet, Jake Morrison. What happened that night was just the beginning." Sarah's words hung in the air between them like smoke from a campfire, visible and substantial but impossible to grasp. Jake found himself studying her face, looking for clues about what she meant by the story not being finished. In his experience, rescue stories had clear endings. Someone was in danger, someone helped them, everyone went home. The complications came later, in different stories altogether. "I'm not sure I follow," he said carefully. Sarah glanced around the ranch, taking in the weathered barn, the sturdy fence lines, and the cattle moving slowly across the pasture. Her gaze lingered on details that suggested she was seeing more than just a working ranch. She was seeing a life, a carefully constructed world that someone had built with intention and care. "This is beautiful," she said, gesturing toward the landscape. "How long have you lived here?" 15 years, give or take." Jake wasn't sure why they were talking about his property, but it felt safer than whatever deeper conversation she was steering toward. "Bought it after I stopped competing professionally." "Rodeo?" "Bull riding, mostly. Some bronc riding." He touched his left shoulder unconsciously. "Until my body decided it had taken enough punishment." Sarah's professional instincts kicked in, and Jake could see her noting the gesture and filing it away. "Shoulder injury?" "Among others. Nothing that kept me from doing what needed doing." She nodded, understanding. "I see a lot of former athletes in the ER. The body keeps score, even when the mind wants to keep going." They were dancing around something, Jake realized. Sarah had come here with a purpose beyond expressing gratitude for an old rescue, but she was taking her time getting to it. The manila envelope in her hands suggested official business, but her manner was too personal for anything purely professional. "Would you like some coffee?" he found himself asking. "It's fresh, and I suspect this conversation might take a while." Relief flickered across Sarah's features. "I'd like that very much." Jake led her up the porch steps and into the kitchen, Rex trailing behind with the casual interest of a dog who'd decided the visitor might be worth monitoring for dropped food. The house was clean but lived in, with the kind of practical functionality that spoke of a man who knew how to take care of himself but didn't much worry about impressing anyone. Sarah settled into a chair at the kitchen table while Jake poured coffee into 2 mismatched mugs. Through the window, they could see the pasture stretching toward the horizon, punctuated by the occasional mesquite tree and the distant silhouettes of cattle. "This feels like home," Sarah observed, accepting her mug with a grateful nod. "I can see why you chose it." "It chose me, more like," Jake replied, settling into the chair across from her. "I was looking for something different after the accident, and this place was the first one that felt right." Sarah sipped her coffee and made an appreciative sound. "My mother always said you could tell a lot about a person by their coffee. This is good coffee." "Your mother sounds like a wise woman." "She is. She's also the reason I'm here, in a way." Sarah set down her mug and opened the manila envelope, pulling out several documents. "After you left that night, the paramedics told her about the cowboy who'd pulled her and her daughter from the wreckage. She asked for your name, but you'd already gone, and the police report just listed you as Good Samaritan in their initial notes." Jake shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "I never was much for paperwork and formalities." "She spent months trying to track you down. Posted notices in local papers, contacted rodeo associations, even hired a private investigator at one point. Nothing came of it." Sarah spread several documents across the table. "She finally gave up, but she never stopped hoping she'd find a way to properly thank you." The documents, Jake could see, were a mixture of official papers and personal items. There were copies of police reports, hospital records, and what looked like newspaper clippings. But there were also handwritten letters and photographs, personal artifacts that suggested a story much larger than the simple rescue he remembered. "She kept all this?" he asked, gesturing toward the papers. "Everything." She said it was important to remember not just what happened, but who made it possible. Sarah pulled out a letter written on hospital stationery, the handwriting shaky but determined. She wrote this 3 days after the accident, when she was still in intensive care. She was convinced she was going to die, and she wanted to make sure someone knew how grateful she was. Jake didn't reach for the letter. Reading it would make everything more real, more personal, and he wasn't sure he was ready for that level of emotional weight. Instead, he focused on Sarah's face, trying to understand what she needed from him. "Your mother survived, you became a doctor, everyone moved on with their lives," he said gently. "That sounds like the best possible ending to me." Sarah's expression grew more serious. "That's what I thought too, until 6 months ago." The shift in her tone sent a warning signal through Jake's nervous system. He'd heard that particular inflection before, usually right before someone delivered news that would change everything. "What happened 6 months ago?" Sarah pulled out a medical report, the kind of official document that Jake associated with bad news and difficult decisions. "My mother was diagnosed with stage 3 pancreatic cancer. The prognosis isn't good." Jake felt the bottom drop out of his stomach. "I'm sorry. That's real hard news. She has maybe 6 months, possibly less." Sarah's voice was steady, but Jake could see the grief she was holding back. "The doctors have done everything they can, but at this point, it's about managing pain and making peace with what's coming." The kitchen fell silent except for the ticking of the wall clock and the distant sound of Rex's tail thumping against the porch as he settled down for a nap. Jake found himself thinking about his own parents, both gone now, and the way grief had a habit of reshaping everything you thought you knew about the world. "What can I do?" he asked, surprising himself with the question. He wasn't someone who typically inserted himself into other people's family crises, but something about Sarah's quiet strength and the weight of their shared history made the offer feel natural. Sarah's eyes filled with tears that she didn't let fall. "She wants to see you. To thank you in person before she can anymore." The request hit Jake like a physical blow. He'd spent 20 years avoiding exactly this kind of emotional complexity, building a life that was simple, predictable, and manageable. The idea of walking into someone's final chapter, of becoming part of their goodbye story, terrified him in ways he couldn't fully articulate. "I don't know," he said quietly. "That's a mighty personal thing, and I'm not sure I'm the right person for it." Sarah leaned forward, her hands flat on the table between them. "Jake, you gave us 20 years. 20 years that wouldn't have existed without you. My mother got to see me graduate high school, college, and medical school. She got to walk me down the aisle at my wedding last year. She got to hold her grandchildren." Jake's head snapped up. "You have children?" A smile broke through Sarah's serious expression. "Twins. A boy and a girl, 18 months old. My mother calls them her miracle babies because they exist because you saved their grandmother's life." The weight of generational consequence settled on Jake's shoulders like a heavy blanket. It wasn't just 2 lives he'd saved that night. It was a whole family tree that had grown from the seeds of that rescue. Children who existed because he'd been driving down Sweetwater Road in the rain, because he'd stopped when he saw those taillights sliding sideways, because he'd climbed down that muddy embankment and reached through a broken window. She named one of them Jacob, Sarah continued softly. "Jacob Chen Morrison. After you." Jake had to set down his coffee mug because his hands were shaking. The idea that somewhere in the world was a child who carried his name, who existed because of choices he'd made 20 years ago, was almost too much to process. He'd never had children of his own, never thought much about legacy or the ways that single actions could ripple forward through time. That's something," he managed. Sarah reached across the table and touched his hand briefly. "She wants to tell you about the life she got to live because of you. She wants you to meet your namesake. She wants to say thank you while she still can." Jake stared out the window at his cattle, thinking about the simple certainty of ranch life. Cattle needed food, water, and shelter. Fences needed mending when they broke. The rhythm of seasons provided structure and meaning. Everything else was complications he'd learned to avoid. But, looking at Sarah, seeing the hope and determination in her eyes, he found himself thinking about the 7-year-old girl who'd trusted him completely when he'd told her everything would be okay. That trust had been a gift he'd never fully appreciated. Maybe it was time to trust her back. "Where is she?" he asked. "Dallas Presbyterian. She's been there for 2 weeks, and the doctors think she has maybe 2 or 3 weeks left." Sarah's voice was steady, professional, but Jake could hear the daughter underneath the doctor. "I know it's a lot to ask. I know you don't know us, not really. But she's spent 20 years wanting to thank you properly, and I can't let her go without giving her that chance." Jake thought about the letter Sarah had mentioned, written from a hospital bed by a woman who thought she was dying. He thought about a little boy named Jacob Chen Morrison who would grow up not knowing that his existence was connected to a night when it rained too hard on Sweetwater Road. He thought about the ways that single moments could define entire lives, creating connections that stretched across decades. "When do you need an answer?" "Now, if possible. I'm driving back to Dallas tonight, and visiting hours end at 8. Jake looked around his kitchen, at the life he'd built that was simple and safe and entirely his own. Then, he looked at Sarah, who'd grown up to save lives the same way he'd saved hers, and realized that some invitations were too important to decline. "I'll need to arrange for someone to watch the cattle," he said slowly. Sarah's face lit up with a smile that transformed her completely. "Does that mean you'll come?" Jake stood up, already mentally running through the list of neighbors who could check on his animals for a day or two. "That means I'll come. But I'm driving myself, and I'm not staying in any fancy hotel. You can stay with me and my husband. We have a guest room, and David would love to meet you." Sarah was gathering up her papers, moving with the efficient energy of someone whose plans had just fallen into place. "The twins are staying with my mother-in-law, so the house will be quiet." As they walked back outside, Jake found himself wondering what he'd just agreed to. The comfortable isolation of his ranch suddenly felt like a luxury he was about to surrender, possibly forever. But, watching Sarah's relief and excitement, seeing how much this meant to her, he knew he'd made the right choice. "One thing," he said as she reached her car. "What's your mother's name? Seems like I should know that before I show up at her bedside." Sarah paused with her hand on the car door, and, for a moment she looked exactly like that 7-year-old girl who'd reached for his hand in the rain. "Lily," she said softly. "Her name is Lily Chen, and she's the strongest person I know. After you, of course." As Sarah's car disappeared down the gravel driveway, Jake stood in his front yard with Rex at his side, looking at the familiar landscape that suddenly felt different. The past had found him after 20 years of careful hiding, and, instead of running from it, he'd agreed to walk directly into its arms. He had phone calls to make, arrangements to organize, and a journey to Dallas that would take him far outside his comfort zone. But, for the first time in years, Jake Morrison felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be, doing exactly what he was meant to do. The story, as Sarah had said, wasn't finished yet. The drive to Dallas took Jake through landscape that gradually transformed from his familiar ranch country to suburban sprawl and city skylines. He'd made the trip only a handful of times over the years, usually for cattle auctions or equipment purchases, and never for anything as personally significant as this. His old pickup truck felt out of place among the sleek sedans and SUVs that populated the highway, but Jake found comfort in its familiar rumble and the way it held steady even when his nerves began to flutter. Sarah had given him detailed directions to Dallas Presbyterian Hospital, along with her cell phone number and strict instructions to call if he got lost or changed his mind. She'd also provided him with visiting hours, parking information, and a gentle warning that her mother was much thinner than she used to be but still had the same bright smile that Jake might remember from that night 20 years ago. What Sarah hadn't prepared him for was the flood of memories that would assault him the moment he walked through the hospital's automatic doors. The antiseptic smell, the soft beeping of machines, the hushed conversations between families clustered in waiting areas, it all transported him back to the night of his own accident, when he'd spent hours in an emergency room having his shoulder rebuilt and his rodeo dreams permanently altered. But this visit was different. This time, he wasn't the patient fighting to understand how his life had changed. This time, he was walking into someone else's story, carrying 20 years of unspoken gratitude and the weight of connections he'd never fully understood. Sarah met him at the elevator on the 7th floor, looking more tired than she had at the ranch but managing a warm smile. She was wearing scrubs, having come straight from her shift in the emergency department, and Jake could see the professional competence that had grown from the frightened child he remembered. "She's been asking about you every hour since I called this morning," Sarah said as they walked down the hallway. "I haven't seen her this excited about anything since the twins learned to walk." Jake's mouth felt dry despite the coffee he'd consumed during the drive. "How is she today?" "Good days and bad days. Today is somewhere in between." Sarah stopped outside room 714 and turned to face him. "Jake, I need to prepare you for how she looks. The cancer has taken a lot from her physically, but her mind is sharp and her spirit is still strong. Don't let her appearance frighten you." Jake nodded, though he wasn't sure anything could have prepared him for the mixture of anticipation and dread that was churning in his stomach. Through the partially open door, he could hear the soft murmur of voices and the gentle hum of medical equipment. "One more thing," Sarah said, her hand on his arm. "She's going to want to hear about your life, what you've been doing these past 20 years. She's spent so long wondering about the cowboy who saved us that you've become almost mythical to her. Just be yourself." Sarah pushed open the door and stepped inside, Jake following behind with the uncertain steps of a man walking into unfamiliar territory. The room was bright with afternoon sunlight, and filled with the kind of personal touches that families bring to make hospital stays more bearable. Photographs covered every available surface, flowers crowded the windowsill, and a hand-knitted afghan was draped over the chair where a man was sitting reading a magazine. In the hospital bed, propped up against several pillows and looking impossibly small beneath the white blankets, was Lily Chen. Jake recognized her immediately, despite Sarah's warnings about her changed appearance. The bones of her face were the same, and her eyes held the same intelligent warmth he remembered from that night in the rain. She was thin, almost fragile, but there was an undeniable strength in the way she held herself and the brightness of her smile when she saw him. "Jake Morrison," she said, her voice softer than he remembered but filled with unmistakable joy. "After all these years." The man in the chair, Sarah's father, Jake realized, stood and extended his hand. "David Chen," he said warmly. "I've been wanting to meet you for 2 decades." Jake shook David's hand, noting the firm grip and the genuine welcome in his eyes. Then, he turned his attention to Lily, who was watching him with an expression of wonder and gratitude that made his chest tight with emotion. "Mrs. Chen," he said, approaching the bed slowly. "It's good to see you again." Lily's laugh was genuine despite her weakness. "Please, call me Lily. I think we're past formalities, don't you?" Jake found himself smiling despite his nerves. "I reckon we are, Lily." Sarah pulled up a chair for Jake and settled into another one beside her father. The room felt full but not crowded, intimate in the way that important conversations demanded. Lily's eyes never left Jake's face, as if she was trying to memorize every detail. "You look exactly like I remembered," she said. "A little older, maybe a little grayer, but still every inch the cowboy who pulled us out of that car." "You have a good memory," Jake replied. "That was a long time ago. Some things you never forget." Lily's expression grew more serious. "I've spent 20 years wanting to tell you what that night meant to us. What you meant to us." Jake shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "You don't need to thank me, Lily. Any decent person would have done the same thing." David leaned forward. "That's where you're wrong, Jake. I've met a lot of people over the years, and I can tell you that most of them wouldn't have stopped. They definitely wouldn't have climbed down that embankment in the rain and risked their own life for strangers." Lily nodded agreement. "The paramedics told us later that the car went into the creek less than 2 minutes after you got Sarah out." 2 minutes. If you hadn't been there, if you hadn't acted so quickly." She trailed off, but Jake could hear the unspoken ending to that sentence. The weight of those 2 minutes settled on Jake's shoulders like a physical presence. He'd never calculated the timing that precisely, never allowed himself to fully understand how narrow the margin had been. The knowledge that he'd been literally moments away from being too late was both humbling and terrifying. Sarah tells me you became a doctor, he said, changing the subject to something that felt safer. Lily's face lit up with pride. Emergency medicine. She saves people every day, just like you saved us. I like to think you inspired her, even though she was so young. Sarah laughed softly. I don't remember much about that night, but I remember feeling completely safe once Jake took my hand. I remember believing absolutely that everything was going to be okay because he said it was. The memory of that moment, the trust in a child's eyes, the weight of responsibility for another person's faith, came back to Jake with startling clarity. He'd carried that image for 20 years without fully understanding its significance. You were a brave little girl, he said to Sarah. Braver than you had any right to be. She gets that from her mother, David said, reaching over to squeeze Lily's hand. Strength in the face of fear runs in the family. For the next hour, they talked about the years that had passed since that night. Lily told Jake about her long recovery from the accident, the physical therapy that had taught her to walk again, the way the experience had changed her perspective on life and made her appreciate every day as a gift. David talked about their courtship and marriage, about the way Sarah had grown from a quiet, thoughtful child into a confident young woman determined to help people. Sarah shared stories from medical school and her residency, describing cases that reminded her of her own rescue and the satisfaction she found in being the person others could depend on in their worst moments. Jake listened, amazed by the ripple effects of that single night, the ways that one act of basic human decency had shaped 3 lives in profound and lasting ways. What about you, Jake? Lily asked eventually. Tell us about your ranch, your life. Sarah said you raise cattle? Jake found himself talking about things he rarely discussed with anyone, the satisfaction of working the land, the rhythm of seasons and the comfort of routine, the way animals responded to consistent care and attention. He told them about Rex, about neighbors who'd become friends over the years, about small-town life and the peace that came from building something lasting with your own hands. As he talked, he realized that Lily was listening with the intensity of someone memorizing every detail. Her questions were specific and personal, as if she was trying to construct a complete picture of the man who'd saved her life. It occurred to Jake that he'd become a kind of guardian angel figure in her imagination, and she was trying to reconcile that mythical person with the real man sitting beside her bed. I brought something for you, Lily said when the conversation had naturally wound down. She reached into the drawer of her bedside table and pulled out a small wooden box, carved with intricate designs. David made this. He's a carpenter by trade, and, after the accident, when we couldn't find you to thank you properly, he made this to hold the gratitude we couldn't express. Jake accepted the box with careful hands. It was beautiful work, smooth and perfectly fitted, obviously created by someone who understood wood and took pride in craftsmanship. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper, was a brass compass with an inscription around the edge, to Jake Morrison, who showed us true north when we were lost. With eternal gratitude, the Chen family. The simple elegance of the gift hit Jake harder than any grand gesture could have. It was practical, meaningful, and personal, exactly the kind of thing he would actually use and treasure. The inscription brought tears to his eyes that he didn't try to hide. This is beautiful, he said, his voice rougher than usual. Thank you. There's something else, Lily said softly. She pulled out a manila envelope similar to the one Sarah had carried to the ranch. Pictures. 20 years of birthdays, graduations, holidays, milestones. A life lived because you were brave enough to act when action was needed. Jake opened the envelope and found himself looking at a photographic timeline of Sarah's growing up. School pictures, birthday parties, prom photos, college graduation. But, mixed among them were pictures of Lily and David, growing older together, building a life and a family. At the back of the envelope was a recent photo, Sarah and a tall man with kind eyes, standing beside 2 bassinets in what was obviously a hospital nursery. The twins, Lily explained. Jacob and Emma. Your namesakes. Jake stared at the photo, at the sleeping babies who existed because he'd been driving down Sweetwater Road 20 years ago. The weight of generational consequence, of lives that stretched forward from a single moment of decision, was almost overwhelming. They're beautiful, he managed. Jacob has your eyes, Sarah said with a smile. Or at least, he has the same calm steadiness I remember from that night. Emma is more like her grandmother, determined and a little stubborn. As visiting hours drew toward an end, Jake realized that something fundamental had shifted during this conversation. The isolation he'd cultivated on his ranch, the walls he'd built around his life to keep it simple and manageable, felt less necessary than they had that morning. These people had become real to him in ways he hadn't expected, and their gratitude had given his own life a meaning and context he'd never fully appreciated. "I need to ask you something, Jake," Lily said as he prepared to leave. "I know this is presumptuous, and I know you have your own life to live, but would you consider staying in touch with us? Sarah's children are going to grow up hearing stories about their namesake, and it would mean the world to them to know you as more than just a legend." Jake looked around the room at these people who'd welcomed him so completely, who'd made him feel like family despite barely knowing him. The idea of regular contact, of being part of their ongoing story, was both appealing and terrifying. "I'd like that," he heard himself say. "I'd like that very much." 2 weeks later, Jake received a phone call that he'd been both expecting and dreading. Lily had passed peacefully in her sleep, surrounded by her family and holding the wooden compass David had made. Sarah asked if he would come to the funeral, not as the stranger who'd saved them 20 years ago, but as a friend who'd become part of their family. Jake stood in his kitchen, looking out at his cattle and thinking about the ways that single actions could ripple forward through time, creating connections and meaning that lasted long after the initial moment had passed. He thought about Lily's smile, about Sarah's determination to save lives the way hers had been saved, about 2 babies named Jacob and Emma who would grow up in a world that was better because people sometimes chose to act with courage and compassion. "I'll be there," he told Sarah. "Family should be together at times like this." After he hung up the phone, Jake walked out to his front porch and sat down in the old wooden chair where he usually watched the sunset. Rex padded over and settled beside him, and together they looked out at the landscape that had been Jake's whole world for 15 years. It was still his world, still the place where he belonged, but it felt bigger now. Connected to other lives, other stories, other possibilities. The isolation that had once felt necessary now felt more like a choice than a requirement, and Jake found himself thinking about trips to Dallas, about watching children grow up who carried his name, about the ways that family could be built from gratitude and connection rather than just blood and proximity. The compass in his pocket caught the late afternoon light, its brass surface warm against his fingers. "True North," the inscription had said. For 20 years, Jake Morrison had thought True North was keeping to himself, avoiding complications, staying safe within the boundaries of his own carefully constructed life. Now he realized that sometimes True North meant reaching out when someone needed help, staying connected when connection was offered, and understanding that the most meaningful stories were the ones that continued long after you thought they were finished. The sun was setting over his ranch, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold that reminded Jake of autumn leaves and new beginnings. Tomorrow he would call Sarah, check on how she was holding up, maybe arrange to visit Dallas again soon. He would write a letter to David, thanking him for the compass and for welcoming a stranger into their family circle. But tonight, Jake Morrison sat on his porch with his dog beside him, holding a brass compass that pointed toward a different kind of true north than he'd ever imagined, and feeling grateful for the ways that single moments of courage could create families, forge connections, and turn strangers into the most important people in each other's lives. The story, as it turned out, was just beginning.